Well, really excited to be here today. I had a Bitcoin for every time I heard regulation or the biggest issue is the regulatory component, I would be retired and I wouldn't be here right now. I'm Colleen Sullivan, co-founder and CEO of Cmt Digital. We trade and invest in the crypto space. We've been doing that for about 8 years. Cmt Digital is a subsidiary of the Cmt Group, which was founded 24 years ago. We have a very long history of trading and investing in the traditional financial markets. We're also a very proud co-founder of the DeFi Alliance. So I'm here today with three of the top attorneys, not only in the crypto blockchain space, but more generally in the legal profession. Jake Chervinsky, Mark Borian, and Mike Fritsch. Jake, and then Mark, and then Mike, if you could briefly introduce yourselves, that would be great, and then we'll dive in.
Sure thing. Thanks, Colleen. As you said, I'm Jake Chervinsky. I am general counsel for Compound Labs. We are an open source software development company focused on the DeFi space, and I'm responsible for all of our legal and regulatory strategy. I also work with the Blockchain Association, a DC trade association, as one of the co-chairs of the DeFi working group, along with my co-chair, Mark. So that's me.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. I'm Mark Boron. I'm general counsel at DYDX Trading, and we are the developers of various DeFi protocols focused on advanced financial products. And before joining DYDX, I was in private practice focused in the crypto space for the last 4 years, and specifically advising DeFi companies for the last 2 years.
Hi, hey, everybody. My name is Mike Frisch. First of all, I apologize for my camera. As you can see, I'm a lawyer and not a technologist. I'm trying to figure out what's going on there. I'm at a small law firm in Chicago called Croak Fairchild Morgan & Barris, but I spent a number of years at the CFTC in the Division of Enforcement, and I brought some of the first cryptocurrency-related cases, specifically a case against Bitfinex, and I worked on most of the, or many of the CFTC's cryptocurrency investigations. So I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. All right, well, let's get started. There's been a lot of news lately around stablecoins. In fact, there was an entire panel earlier in the event devoted to that topic. Earlier this week, Treasury Secretary Yellen convened a meeting of the President's Working Group on Financial Markets to talk about stablecoins. And then I also thought it was interesting in Chairman Gensler's remarks yesterday before the ABA Derivatives and Futures Law Committee, where he referenced stable value tokens. So if I'm sitting in the seat of a traditional financial institution and I look into DeFi, I see about 76 billion total value locked in stablecoins. And I probably understand that the foundation of DeFi is stablecoins. So I'm probably wondering what regulation may look like if it's coming and how that may impact DeFi. So Mark, if it's okay with you, let's get your thoughts there first and then move over to Jake and Mike.
Sure. I won't get into this too much, but I think it's worth breaking down stablecoins into 3 different categories, right? We've got fiat-backed stablecoins, and then we could call them like real-world or crypto asset-backed stablecoins, and then you've got algorithmic stablecoins. And I think the regulatory regimes that will apply to the 3 of them are going to be frankly different. I think when Chairman Gensler referred to stable value coins, I think those could fit into like any 3 of those categories. But then when you talk about, I think some of like the shadow banking issues that you hear, people talking about in Congress, I think they're more focused on like the fiat-backed stablecoins. So it's very hard to like pinpoint what the regulations might look like. In terms of the impact on DeFi, I think it's like slightly easier, but still difficult. The easiest thing to focus on is that a lot of DeFi relies on oracles, and essentially oracles looks at the price of like assets, specifically usually like real world assets. And a lot of times when oracles are being used to look at the value of certain crypto assets, including stable coins, a lot of the products are built on the assumption that there's not going to be a huge variation in the oracle prices that are shown. If for some reason there is some kind of attack on a stablecoin, or even a regulatory position that's taken that frankly creates less trust, potentially, let's say in Asia, with respect to the viability of certain stablecoins, and you see fluctuations in the prices of those stablecoins, that's potentially one area where you see an impact on DeFi. I think more broadly, though, what you see is actually just pushing probably crypto-backed and algo stablecoins further ahead at a faster pace as folks look to kind of potentially move away from fiat-backed stablecoins that are more easily regulated than crypto-backed and algo stablecoins that I think might be more difficult to regulate. The last point that I'll say is I think with regulation comes costs and inefficiencies. And so it wouldn't be surprising to see stablecoins right now, which are free effectively to use, fiat-backed stablecoins, to actually have some sort of fees that end up being incurred in one way or another, because ultimately stablecoin providers plan to make money in one way or another. And if the answer can't be diversification of those dollars into something that gives them returns, they're going to be looking for something else.
Yeah. Jake?
I second all of that. I think that when regulators think about stablecoins, they have sort of three different categories of concerns. One is about consumer protection issues. This is where they're worried that stablecoins aren't actually stable, right? Maybe they're not actually backed by the assets that the issuers claim they're backed by, or maybe they use some sort of game theoretic algorithmic strategy that isn't really going to work, right? We saw this with Mark Cuban, who lost a bunch of money investing in an algorithmic stablecoin and then complained afterwards that it had been called a stablecoin when in fact it wasn't. The second issue is monetary sovereignty. So especially here in the US, with the sort of increasing interest in modern monetary theory, which really requires the government to be the only issuer of currency. There's some concern about privately issued money, period. And then I think the third concern is the one we always talk about, which is the anti-money laundering issues. I think that regulators are really concerned that there will be illicit activity in stablecoins. And because stablecoins are already tracking the value of the dollar, that will reduce the desire of bad actors to use fiat on and off ramps where otherwise they would be surveilled and where their activity can be censored. So, I think it remains to be seen sort of what specific regulations will come from that. We've seen some proposals so far, like the Stable Act, which would basically say only chartered banks could issue stablecoins. We've seen, statements from the president's working group talking about how all stablecoins have to run in a system that is surveilled end to end, meaning that the holder of every single wallet that has stablecoins has to be KYC'd and all transactions have to be censorable. I'm not really sure how that's all going to play out. I think that's, as Mark said, there's a lot of promise behind stablecoins in a true decentralized and permissionless ecosystem. Hopefully we can preserve some of that, but I do think that stablecoins are in the crosshairs right now.
Yeah. And Mike, any thoughts to add there?
Not much, other than to say that, it's really, nobody can doubt the utility of stablecoins in the current environment, and especially in the development of DeFi over the last few years. And I think regulators saw, we all saw what happened with Tether and the case that the New York regulators brought. I just think more confidence in the backing and the stability and the trustworthiness of stablecoins is going to lead to wider and deeper adoption, especially by institutions. So I think, I don't have a good sense of what regulation is going to look like, whether that comes in the form of enforcement action or a statute. But I think more confidence and more transparency ultimately will be good for the market.
Yeah, agreed. And I do hope here that instead of leading with enforcement, there would be a collaborative effort with the industry, just given the widespread use of stablecoins that exist today, so we can work together there. All right, Mark and Jake, you are both very active over the holidays with the Treasury Department's proposed rulemaking with respect to self-hosted wallets, which, if implemented as proposed, would have been problematic for DeFi. The industry was successful in working with FinCEN to delay that rulemaking. However, we now have FATF to contend with, and that's a global issue versus a US issue. Jake, starting with you, could you provide an overview of FATF's proposed guidance specific to DeFi, the current status, and what we think the potential impact for DeFi could be?
Sure. So in March of this year, the FATF put out draft guidance updating their recommendations for anti-money laundering regulation of virtual assets, which is the term that they use for crypto. Basically, the most important element of what they proposed was to expand the definition of a VASP, a virtual asset service provider, to capture additional entities that don't actually custody any assets, that don't actually sit within the flow of funds. So traditionally, unfortunately, the definition of a regulated financial institution that has anti-money laundering compliance obligations is only limited to a custodial intermediary, meaning an intermediary that actually takes custody at some point of customer funds, right? They receive or transmit customer funds on behalf of their customers. The FATF proposal was to say, we're going to extend that definition even to non-custodial market participants who are perhaps writing software or providing interfaces that allow people to transact, even though those intermediaries don't actually sit within the flow of funds. The impact on DeFi of a guidance or a new adoption of that type of rule would be to capture a massive number of additional market participants that don't currently have obligations to KYC users of their interfaces or to file reports with the government. I think that would be a huge departure from how the DeFi ecosystem works now. It's also a massive expansion of the anti-money laundering regime to force companies to surveil others even though they don't actually have custody of anyone else's funds, and thus don't really have the ability to force those parties to hand over the information that the AML regulations would typically require. Thankfully, the FATF didn't, or at least hasn't yet, implemented that proposal. So they presented this as draft guidance in March. They asked the community, the industry, for feedback. The public gave a lot of feedback over the course of the month and a half that we had to write comments. And of course, the response was overwhelmingly negative. I think people did a great job of calling out all of the collateral damage that a rule like this would cause. We had expected the FATF to finalize that guidance this month, or actually at the end of last month, at the end of June, during their last plenary session. And thankfully, they decided, because of how many comments there were explaining the downsides to a rule like this, the FATF decided to kick the can down the road a little bit further. So they've said that instead of finalizing the guidance, they're going to work with industry to try to improve the guidance, and they'll come back to it this November. So the hope that we have is that they've heard us loud and clear on not expanding the definition of a VASP to non-custodial market participants, but it remains to be seen what's going to happen in November. And the last point I'll throw in is, although the FATF guidance is sort of the organizing principle right now for how we understand development of global anti-money laundering compliance, the member countries, the member jurisdictions of the FATF are already taking action even before that guidance is finalized. So just this week, we saw a new draft guidance, rather a new draft rule from the EU, which essentially would implement the FATF guidance, even though it's not finalized yet. So this is an active issue, not just with the FATF, but also within all the member jurisdictions.
Yeah, thank you. Mark or Mike, anything to add on FATF?
The only thing that I'd add is that effectively what originally was proposed would have ended up creating very duplicative obligations. So there's a world in which what was proposed could, for example, if you were to impose it on governance token holders, and frankly, some of the language was very unclear around whether you're acting kind of as a business or not, things like that. That made it really hard. But ultimately, people have nothing to do with actually providing custody, and potentially thousands of various people who have no additional insight to what regulators would have if they just go on chain and look at the data, would now have obligations to potentially make filings and keep records at least. And it's kind of like why you make an individual keep a record that another 1,000 individuals are going to keep records of, when you can literally just go on chain and find the exact record that this individual is now keeping.
Yeah, I think about that a lot in the context of, maybe the industry, or some industry group helping regulators in terms of interpreting the on-chain data that is there. We all have the same data, and sometimes I think it's just a matter of helping people figure out how to read that data. So it's interesting. Mike, I'm going to come over to you because, I think we have to cover the SEC and the CFTC and just how each of them are looking at the DeFi space. So if you could add some thoughts there, that would be super helpful. And then I see a bunch of stuff in the chat on the DeFi Education Fund. I promise we're going there next, but let's cover our main regulators first here. So Mike, over to you on the SEC and the CFTC.
Sure. So although I've been out of government now for a little bit, I still am friendly with many of the regulators, and there's a lot of interest in the space. And as many of you attended Chairman Gensler's remarks yesterday, and I think I'll read from some of them in a moment. But he issued a warning. Here, maybe I'll do it now. He essentially said, make no mistake, it doesn't matter whether it's a stock token, a stable value token, or any other virtual product that provides synthetic exposure to underlying securities. He said, whether it's in the DeFi space or not, they're implicated by the securities laws and must work within our securities regime. And then later on in the remarks, he used the famous adage, if it waddles like a duck and quacks like a duck, it should be regulated like a duck, which we've all heard before.
The duck test. I mean, why not?
Yeah, we've got the Howey test, and now we've got the duck test. And I think the CFTC sees things similarly. When I was there, there's really little interest in regulating technologies as technologies per se, but rather use cases of technologies. And I think I heard Joe Lubin say something that around that yesterday, and I could not agree more. So I think really what the CFTC and the SEC are looking at is, are things functioning like derivatives? Are platforms offering leverage trading opportunities to retail customers in the U.S.? Are they providing synthetic exposure to securities and therefore acting like securities? I think there is significant risk of an enforcement action being brought in the very near future for these use cases of DeFi. But of course, regulators are going to have to grapple with all kinds of interesting issues, such like can you bring an enforcement action against a piece of software? Is this a person that can be regulated by the act? But I think stepping back from that, clearly the laws need to be updated to account for what's happening now. But with the current toolkit, regulators they want to establish their jurisdiction. They want to stake out their claim in the space. And for the CFTC, it's they see something that looks like a derivative that's being offered, and they want to plant their flag in the ground there. And a lot of education and a lot of quick action by the community is going to be needed if you want to, if there's going to be a real effort to educate them and ward off some of that action. Because I agree with everybody, regulation by enforcement action is not as good as regulation by ex ante clear guidance and rules.
Yeah, Jake, Mark, anything to add there on the SEC or the CFTC and DeFi?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on, and I completely agree with Mike's explanation as well. I think one phenomenon that we're seeing here in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, is a lack of willingness in Congress to take any action related to crypto. And in fact, Congress, basically isn't taking action on anything, even unrelated to crypto. And so what this means is there's a lot more pressure on the executive branch and the agencies that have some authority to take action to do as much as they possibly can. And I think that actually was one of the reasons why Gary Gensler was selected to be the SEC chair. He's someone who's known for pushing the boundaries of, authority in agencies. When he was chair of the CFTC, this is something that he did around Dodd-Frank. And so I think that this isn't totally unexpected. I also think that for so long, the SEC and also the CFTC have been saying to the industry, we want to understand better what it is that you're doing. We want you to come talk to us. And, every SEC statement that we got for a very long period of time, if you look at the very end of it, it will always end with the same statement, please come talk to us, come speak with FinHub, which was, created and advanced as sort of the SEC's touch point with industry. I don't think that has really happened all that much. And so I think part of what we're seeing now is more of a warning shot than just an invitation to come, and speak with them. I do think, though, that once we get into those conversations, and this is partly what the DeFi Education Fund is for, we will be able to explain that, the duck test is wonderful, but just because something has feathers doesn't mean it's a duck. And what you have to do with these things is you have to look at the nuance and the details of what the issues actually are, right? Is there actually an information asymmetry between the creator of an asset and the holder of the asset that justifies the application of the securities laws? Or on the CFTC side, is there really a need for us to force exchange trading of derivative assets when those derivative assets are already trading on open public blockchains that are fully transparent and auditable at all times. So I think these are conversations that we have to have. And now is the time for us to start engaging in those discussions to explain why the risks aren't necessarily the same as similar looking financial instruments in the traditional system.
That's great. Mark, anything to add there before we turn to the DeFi Education Fund?
No, I don't have anything to add. Mike and Jake gave a great overview of that.
Awesome. Yeah, so let's go there. I think often when we are having these conversations about DeFi and the regulatory environment, we're always focused on the risks, and we forget that the risks have an equal side here. It's a two-sided equation, and we forget the benefits. And I do put the DeFi Education Fund in that category of trying to help bridge this gap, as you were saying, Jake, and help educate the regulators so we can start having this conversation. And that initiative is really, part of its mission, my understanding, is to proactively engage with regulators and policymakers and be a partner to help us get to a better place of collaboration instead of this current environment that we find ourselves in. At least that's the way I perceive it. So Mark, Jake, would love to hear about the DeFi Education Fund, and I think our audience is dying to hear about it based on what we're seeing in the chat here. So I'll let you guys take it away.
Sure. I think the DeFi Education Fund, for those who are not aware of it, is 501c4 that for the time being has been funded by one kind of DAO community, the Uniswap community. It was funded with Uni tokens, and collectively has value of between like 15 and 20 million. And the general idea behind the DeFi Education Fund is, I think, twofold. One of them is to actually educate. And the education needs to be at the congressional level, it needs to be at the regulatory level, it needs to be global, but it also needs to go beyond that. It has to educate academics who write papers about this stuff, right? It has to educate, I think, frankly, users who use this stuff and where the risks are and where the benefit and how it can be, so that they can then go ahead and educate others. There's a certain amount of like empowering a broader group to be able to do more education rather than having one group doing all of the education or just a small group of people. If you can kind of give more knowledge that can then be shared, that's better. The second part of it is that to move policy, having like a few people, and frankly, even just the DeFi community trying to individually do it is difficult. And that means you need capital for others to be able to be willing to do stuff. And a lot of that might just be human resources that others might need. And so being able to, make grants to be able to kind of further certain policy objectives, or frankly, again, present the differences between kind of centralized finance and decentralized finance. So like one of the biggest things that is missing right now, I think in Congress, is like a few pages that literally say, so here's your policy on CeFi, here's how DeFi addresses that policy concern. Here's your other concern around CeFi. Here's what you implemented in terms of laws to address them. Here's why that law literally should not apply because it's not relevant in DeFi. That's the type of things kind of overall that I think we'd like to see, and that, funding and I think human capital will help move forward. That's
great. Jake?
Yeah, I second all of that. I think, for me, what's most important to think about here is the importance of having resources in order to do this kind of work. We are only a limited group of people who understand DeFi, and we should not underestimate the complexity of DeFi. It is extraordinarily complex and hard to understand. I think that's one of the reasons that there are so few of us who really have a deep knowledge of this. And there are so many regulators and policymakers who have a hand one way or another in these issues. We can only have so many conversations. And I think everything Mark just said is absolutely right about producing written materials. But sometimes this just comes down to having a face-to-face conversation and hearing the questions from the policymakers, which can be as simple as not understanding functionally how a DeFi protocol works to very complex questions about the risks posed by DeFi and how they can be addressed by current or potentially new regulations. We just need to staff up. We need more people on the ground having those conversations in order to move the ball forward. So I think that's a really wonderful thing that we'll have through the DeFi Education Fund.
That's great. Yeah, it definitely seems that with all of the movement, I mean, the way I see DeFi, right, is it exists the way it looks today, but going forward, you're going to have gaming, creator, social, all these different economies plugging into this DeFi foundation. So I think it is really important that we get this right in collaboration with regulators. And I mean, I think that's a place where people are going to go to work. They will go to work in these different economies, that have DeFi as their base layer. So I do think, what regulators have done in the past with self-regulation and allowing the industry itself to help govern itself is something that hopefully can be done out of this initiative too. And then down the road, regulators have that playbook that you hand to them for when they, decide to put formal regulation in place. I do want to touch on something in the chat here, and that is just I know you guys have put a lot of thought into, this being an approved initiative by the Uniswap community and providing transparency and accountability to the community. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think there's the key with the DeFi Education Fund and why it was structured like this is that it is a 501c4. And effectively what that means is there is a stated purpose consistent with the purpose that I was describing earlier, that all the board members and the company is required to kind of abide by. And so the goal in that case is going to be to essentially enhance DeFi and the education and advocacy of it with respect to educators, and that there's really no room to kind of deviate from that. I think a key thing is that when we looked at kind of the DeFi Education Fund, when it was presented to me, for me, the key was that it's not just one DAO that is participating, and that's something that DeFi is doing more broadly. And I think that's very important. And so I think for that reason, it's important to have a purpose that is consistent with that the 501c4 needs to carry out. And so the DeFi Education Fund's goal is to carry out things that broadly will assist kind of DeFi rather than any single protocol.
That's great.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just to add one point, I think, in a way, not only are we advocating for DeFi, but we are also pushing the boundaries of DeFi itself. One of the issues that I think we're also trying to figure out in DeFi is how can you have a decentralized protocol that is governed by a dispersed, unaffiliated group of people who can also engage or hire specific contractors or get companies to do certain projects or to pursue a particular mission. That's something that we're sort of exploring now. And I think the idea that Mark just said about having cross-protocol participation in some of these types of projects is new ground that we're trying to plow now. And not everything is going to go perfect the first time. I think that's just like with DeFi protocols themselves. Some of this is up to experimentation. I think that it would be foolish for us to say that the rollout of the DeFi Education Fund was flawless. I think we've learned a lot of lessons, and hopefully others will learn from that and be able to improve and iterate as time goes on. That is sort of what is at the heart of DeFi anyway. It's sort of this open source mentality of taking the things that work and throwing out the things that don't, and then improving as you go forward. So that's sort of how I think about the initial structuring of the DeFi Education Fund. My hope is that we will prove that this model does work, and will attract other funds from other protocols once we've shown that we're worth it.
Great, thank you, Mike. I want to turn back to you real quick here. So, one thing I think about a lot, and Imran, I'll make this quick. One thing I think about a lot is, I have the privilege every day of talking to founders in this space. And I see with the space, what's happening today. And then I also see where we're going pretty clearly. And while I see, some of the risks in the space, of course, there's many, and we're working very hard to mitigate those. But mostly I see opportunity, just so much promise. But then I think about the regulators and I think about what they see all day. They see, ransomware. They see cryptocurrency used for ransomware payments. They see rug pulls in DeFi, and they're really focused on that. From the seat you sat in when you were with the CFTC, what can we do to bridge that gap? How can we get part of the conversation really focused on the benefits and the promise of not only what's happening now, but what's going to happen in the future? Like, how can we as a community help get us to this more collaborative place?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And you and I have had some conversations about this offline in the past. It's so important to start changing the narrative around DeFi and crypto in general, from it being a problem to being an opportunity and a way for, exactly what we saw with the Colonial Pipeline hack is a good example. People focus on the fact that crypto can sometimes be a vehicle for ransom payments, but in that case, the FBI was able to seize funds from the wallet, something that would have been very difficult to do if something was paid with fiat currency. So it's in a lot of ways it's safer, it's more transparent, it's more traceable than the old financial systems. I think regulators are starting to understand it, but I think getting ahead of it and starting a narrative and talking to the policymakers who get to think about policy as opposed to trying to write rules through enforcement actions is a good way to go. To the the mindset of the SEC and the CFTC enforcement divisions, to them, they're looking for their hammers and they're out looking for nails and to hit. And that's really not the best way to design a regulatory scheme or to foster innovation. Because the primary, as you said, the primary consideration for many of these regulators is investor protection. That's what they're thinking about every day. So I think more education and moving quickly in order to propose a scheme that makes sense to them and distinguishes some of these technologies from the things they're used to regulating, it could be really valuable.
Great. And Mark, Jake, Mike, any final thoughts before Imran kicks us all off?
The only thing that I'll add is that, I think so much of the discussion on DeFi is around like a defense of DeFi and all the bad things that can happen and, why it is that, these things aren't so bad. But I think in that, like, a lot is lost in terms of actually just actively talking about the benefits before ever even getting to needing to defend against the rest. And, I think people cover that quite a bit, like in other kind of situations. But I think the key ones, right, is like the permissionless aspect of it, right? It's accessible to anyone at any time in a way that financial services usually aren't kind of accessible to others. There's costs and efficiencies and time efficiencies that come from the composable nature of DeFi. And I know we're short on time, so I'm not going to keep going, but like I could continue, and I know others.
Lack of counterparty risk is another huge one. A lack of intermediary risk.
Yep. Yeah. The non-custodial nature of it doesn't require trusting others. You could go on, and these are like meaningful benefits that we don't talk about enough because we're kind of on our heels talking about why it's not so bad.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I love what you brought up. You take a situation like Archegos, in the example you gave, and you can go side by side. If this had happened in DeFi, what is the result? And I think that drawing those analogies as we move forward will really be helpful, where you do the traditional finance versus DeFi versus CeFi and make those comparisons for people. So Imran, I think you being here means that we are formally out of time.
Yeah, we're at the end of the entire event, but I really appreciate everyone here on the panel speaking. Obviously, regulatory is like top of mind for DeFi, being that it's more bleeding edge technology. So on part of like the entire DeFi community, thank you guys for fighting the fight. What we see that happens on closed doors, others don't see that. And so on behalf of the DeFi community, thank you guys so much for fighting for us. Otherwise, if you have any questions or any final comments, please feel free to let the community know. Otherwise, I will end it from here.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.